Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
For nearly 20 years, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were seen as the perfect Hollywood, Nashville love story, an Oscar-winning actress and a country music star who overcame the odds. But behind the red carpets and duets, things were falling apart. Court documents now reveal Nicole filed for divorce after 19 years, with sources saying she fought to save the marriage. His first public performance post-split showed no wedding ring, no love song for Nicole, and altered lyrics that hinted at rewritten history. The golden couple image has shattered, and Nicole's side is finally emerging. We take a closer look at what made them so admired, and what led to the end of one of Hollywood's most iconic love stories. Nicole, the shy dreamer turned Hollywood royalty Nicole Mary Kidman was born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1967, to Australian parents who were temporarily abroad. Her father, Anthony Kidman, was a clinical psychologist and biochemist, and her mother, Janelle, was a nurse and educator. When she was still a child, the family returned to Sydney, where she grew up in a household steeped in both discipline and ambition. Unlike the bright, poised figure she later became, young Nicole was painfully shy. She would blush so intensely when asked to speak in class that her teachers worried she lacked confidence. Yet, that timidity was paired with a powerful imagination. She sought refuge in performance, first in ballet, then drama classes, and finally in youth theater groups where she could channel the emotions she found hard to express in daily life. By her teens, her talent was undeniable. Australia's film industry at the time was blossoming, and she seized her chance, landing roles in television movies and eventually was cast in the 1983 cult thriller BMX Bandits. Her porcelain features and height made her stand out, but it was her emotional range that convinced directors she was destined for more. By the late 1980s, Hollywood came calling. It was during this rise that Nicole met Tom Cruise, her first great love and her first great heartbreak. They got married in 1990, becoming one of Hollywood's most photographed couples. For Nicole, the marriage brought prestige but also pain. Scientology, which is Tom's religion, cast a long shadow over their union. While she rarely speaks in detail about those years, it is well known that when the marriage ended in 2001, she lost not just a husband but also primary custody of their two adopted children, Isabella and Connor. This wound cut deep. Friends later revealed that Nicole felt stripped of motherhood itself, relegated to the edge of her children's lives. For a woman who longed for a family of her own, the rupture would become one of the defining traumas of her life. It is perhaps no coincidence that when she later met Keith Urban, she was determined to rebuild the dream of home and family she had lost. Keith, the troubled dreamer with a guitar. Keith Lionel Urban was born across the Tasman Sea in Whangarei, New Zealand, the same year as Nicole. His family moved to Queensland, Australia when he was still young, and it was there that his personality began to take on a restless and rebellious hue that was constantly seeking some form of escape. His father, Bob, owned a convenience store but was also passionate about country music, a genre not exactly mainstream in suburban Australia. He encouraged young Keith to pick up the guitar, and by the age of 6 he was already performing. Country music, with its tales of heartbreak and redemption, offered him both identity and therapy, but while his musical talent was prodigious, his home life was less harmonious. Allegedly, he lived in a family marked by tension and financial struggles, which may have contributed to his lifelong search for stability. In his teens, he performed in talent shows and small bars, cultivating not just his sound but also his image as the brooding country outsider with a rock star's edge. He soon dropped out of school to pursue music full-time. For Keith, there was no plan B. Music was his only ticket out, but along with the talent came demons. By his 20s, he was already experimenting with alcohol and harmful substance. Fame, when it arrived, didn't steady him, it amped up the chaos. He moved to Nashville in the early 1990s, hungry for recognition, and after years of grinding on the circuit, his breakthrough finally came in 1999 with his self-titled American debut album. Suddenly, Keith was country music's new heartthrob, known for his guitar prowess, tousled hair, and a voice that dripped with longing. However, behind the scenes, the success was laced with self-destruction. By the time he met Nicole in 2005, he had already been in and out of rehab. He lived with the perpetual fear that his addictions might cost him everything he had fought to build. Nicole and Keith seemed, on paper, to come from different worlds, a case of Hollywood prestige versus Nashville grit. What really bound them was the baggage they carried. Nicole bore the scars of a lost family and a marriage that made her wary of control and betrayal. Keith carried the volatility of a man who had known both obscurity and fame, but never quite conquered the urge to sabotage himself. When their paths finally crossed, Both were at turning points. Nicole had re-emerged from her divorce stronger than ever, winning an Academy Award for The Hours and cementing her reputation as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Yet she remained emotionally raw, craving stability after a decade of turbulence. Keith, meanwhile, was a star on the rise, carving out his space in the hyper-competitive world of American country music, but the trappings of fame, endless touring, temptation, and the demands of an industry that prizes image as much as sound were pushing him to the brink. He needed someone who could anchor him, who could help him believe in something beyond the stage lights. Looking back, it is impossible not to see the foreshadowing. Her desire for control and stability was always going to clash with Keith's restless, addictive personality. Their union carried the promise of healing. Perhaps she could rebuild the family she'd lost, and he could find redemption in her steadiness, but it also carried the seeds of future conflict. For Nicole, the idea of being with another celebrity carried its own risks. Her marriage to Tom Cruise had taught her how brutal the public gaze could be, but with Keith she saw vulnerability, even fragility, and it called to her protective instincts. For him, she was both a muse and a mirror, someone whose discipline and success highlighted his own instability, but whose love offered him the chance to become the man he always wanted to be. Their early lives had carved them into complex, wounded individuals. When they finally collided in 2005, it felt like destiny, but in truth, it was more like volatile chemistry crossing paths and fairytale romance. When Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban finally crossed paths in 2005, it was publicized as a story straight out of Hollywood fantasy. Two Australians, both global stars, both born in the same year, both hardened by past struggles, colliding at the exact moment their lives seemed poised for renewal. The red carpets and glossy magazines painted their meeting as fate, but beneath the surface, the relationship was less about destiny and more about two wounded people clinging to the hope of salvation. The first spark came at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles in January 2005, a celebration of Australians working in Hollywood. Nicole was fresh from the storm of her divorce with Tom Cruise, but by then she had rebuilt her career and stood tall as an Oscar-winning actress. Keith, on the other hand, was the rising Nashville star whose records were starting to cross into mainstream pop appeal. When they were introduced, she later admitted she didn't think he was interested. He was polite but reserved, and though they exchanged numbers, he didn't call her for months. She confessed years later that his initial lack of approach nearly derailed the love story before it began, but when he finally reached out, something clicked. Their romance moved quickly once it began. By May, they were photographed together, and by the end of the year, she was describing him in interviews as the man who had swept her off her feet. For her, who had lived through the suffocating surveillance of her marriage to Tom, he represented freedom. He was passionate, raw, and unpolished in every way that Tom Cruise wasn't. For Keith, she represented legitimacy, elegance, and the kind of stabilizing force he had never known. By November he was walking red carpets with Nicole, not just as her date but as her partner. Their chemistry was obvious and the press fell hard for the pair. Australia's golden children had found each other in America. In June 2006, just over a year after they began dating, they married in a lavish ceremony at the Cardinal Soretti Memorial Chapel on Sydney's Manly Peninsula. She wore a Balenciaga gown with a dramatic veil, while he, with his trademark long hair, looked every bit the romantic troubadour. The guest list glittered with Hollywood royalty and country music stars, but the real story was the intimacy of the event. She reportedly walked into the church by candlelight, holding back tears, while he serenaded her during the reception. For fans, it was the picture-perfect ending to both of their troubled pasts. Nicole, the woman who had endured the controlling grasp of her previous love, had found a man who appeared to adore her unconditionally. Keith, meanwhile, had found redemption in the arms of one of the world's most respected actresses. Unfortunately, unlike fairy tales, reality was less perfect. The first cracks just 4 months into the wedding, Keith checked himself into rehab for alcohol abuse. It was a devastating blow to their newlywed bliss. Nicole had barely finished writing her thank you cards when she was thrust into a crisis. The tabloids pounced, suggesting she had married a time bomb. For him, the relapse was humiliating. He had vowed that her love would be enough to keep him steady, but his old habits resurfaced quickly. Nicole, ever protective of her private life, chose loyalty over embarrassment. She stood by him, visiting him in rehab and refusing to give the press the satisfaction of seeing her falter.